The frosty air, with its spindly, reaching fingers, is gnawing at the doors. The darkness rolls over our lands as silent as velvet and blends with the day's shadows. The sun has sought shelter beyond the horizon, leaving the stars sentry above the earth with the moon in her wondrous silver crown, watching over us in our dreams. At this time of year, it's easier to imagine those dark, eerie stories that have haunted generations, those nameless fears that shape the lore of the land and lurk deep in the shadows. And they are patient. They wait until their name is barely a whisper shared between generations, a forgotten evil biding its time whilst we sleep in our beds. Gather closer around the fire. Turn your back to the night. Close your eyes. Let go and take flight. Beyond this world and into the mist, hand in hand, we walk the edge and stare into the abyss. I shall tell you a tale of those who went too far, who laughed at the warnings passed down, shared by the old folk. Here in East Anglia, we have many dark tales of what happens when the ancient ones are crossed. And one such tale is as follows, and that is the tale of the Callow Pit Coffer. There is a place at the boundary of Malton St. Mary and Cantley where the sun never seems to reach, a cavernous hollow at a crossroads where the water lies still and bottomless, a pit that holds so many secrets lost to time. All those in the surrounding villages know not to linger there, and even to speak of it could summon trouble. It was once a favoured spot for highwaymen and smugglers to hide their loot, to wait until the coast was clear and return to claim their ill-gotten gains. Some say a headless highwayman still returns to guard the spot, unable to let go of what was left behind. The greed and violence that was poured into this pit festered and inevitably drew the attention of Old Nick. There, at the bottom of the pit, he waited, knowing one day someone would be foolish enough to ignore the old warnings. For years, whispers of the treasure unclaimed was passed on, and young ears often thought of testing their luck. And then one day, his patience paid off. Two brothers from Southwood were at a local inn when they heard this tale. As the ale flowed, the promise of riches soon outweighed any danger, and despite warnings from the locals, they vowed to retrieve the treasure. They found a ladder and a chain with a hook on the end, and set off in the direction of the pit. As they walked, all the creatures in the hedgerows seemed to go quiet. The wind hushed, and the moon's gaze seemed to hone in on them. They could feel eyes watching them, and the earth itself seemed to hold its breath. Their footsteps seemed unnaturally loud as they neared the crossroads, and they both stopped to look at each other. They did not need to say anything, but both knew what the other was starting to wonder, if this had been a good idea. Their breath hung in the air as the cold seemed to deepen around them. They heard a strange sound emerge from the darkness, rapidly getting closer and closer. Something was galloping fast from the east, as if outrunning the sunrise itself. Closer and closer. Silhouetted against a sliver of pink in the sky, vague shape of a horseman was bolting in the direction of the two brothers. Burdened down with a heavy ladder and chain, they could only stand there, frozen in terror as it drew nearer and nearer. They could feel the earth tremble now, a thrumming of hoof steps that echoed across the hollow. It was so close, too close. They could only watch as it bounded towards them, nostrils flared and eyes glowing red. The rider sat atop, hunched over as if looking for something on the ground. It sat bolt upright, and they gasped. Its hood fell back, revealing nothing. In the space where the head should have been, there was nothing. The shock seemed to give the brothers the spurt they needed to move at last. Backing into the hedge, they cowered as the beast passed, shrieking and whinnying, a terrible, unearthly, desperate sound that froze their very blood. And then it was gone. Suddenly, and without any lingering echo, it blinked out of existence, and only the cloud of vapour left from the horse's last gasp hung in the air. The brothers waited a while, in case it returned, but they both knew that whatever it was gone. They caught each other's gaze, terror behind both their eyes. When at last they could move, they wondered whether to continue or not. "I say, that proves the treasure is real," said the eldest brother. "If its desire to find its treasure continues into death, imagine what riches lie below." So on they went, a little warier, but determined to see this through. The pit loomed in front of them, a void in the ground that felt as if it had its own gravitational pull, pulling them closer. Upon reaching the edge, the younger brother picked up a stone and cast it in. The surface of the water broke with gentle ripples that glinted in the moonlight. They waited a while, but there was no other movement from below. They stretched the ladder over the open maw of the pit, making sure it was steadily resting on the opposite side. Taking the chain between them, they carefully crossed to the middle, and with one final look at each other, they stopped and dropped it into the pit. The chain was long and seemed to descend for an age before finally hitting the bottom. They dragged it back and to, occasionally catching on something and excitedly pulling it up, only to find an old carriage wheel, decaying branches, and long, sinewy weeds wrapped around the hook. The sun was beginning to peak above the horizon when they finally caught it on something heavy. Grinning at each other, they began to pull. Nearby, a crow startled and began to caw, joined by another, and then another. A chorus of calls erupted around them, a warning. But they were too intent on retrieving whatever it was they had anchored the hook onto. As it drew nearer to the surface, they could make out a chest. Yes, a chest. The treasure they had hoped for. They started to laugh and pulled faster and faster. I do not know how the story would have ended if what happened next hadn't happened. If they could have been content with their fortune and humble in their victory, but the younger brother, full of triumph, shouted, "We've got it now! Even the devil himself couldn't take it off us." First, the crows scattered. Then the sun was swallowed by a dark cloud. The air stilled, and a deep, low rumble started from below. The brothers looked at each other. "What have you done?" the eldest asked, visibly shaken, with his eyes wide in horror. The water beneath them began to broil and bubble, the waves lapping furiously at the shore. They hastened, pulling at the chain so hard their hands started to bleed. It broke the surface, and they could see the ornate chest and the hook that had caught around one of the handles bobbing on the surface. With their final strength, they heaved the chest out of the water, and for a moment, it seemed as if they had claimed their prize. But with a crash of water beneath them, a giant, blackened, gaunt, cadaverous hand reached out and grabbed the other handle. And for a moment, a tussle ensued, but the giant hand gripped tighter and yanked the chest from their grasp, sending them backwards onto the ladder. The hand, still attached to the chest, disappeared beneath the surface, and all was still again, save for the sound of their thundering heartbeats. Picking up the chain, they ran, leaving the ladder across the pit, and bolted for the church, whose spire stood beckoning beyond the lane. They crashed through the doors, startling the priest, who was at prayers. It took them a while to calm down enough to recount what had happened, and apart from asking a few questions, the priest patiently listened to their tale. When they got to the part with the chest and the hand, they showed the chain and were shocked to find the handle was still attached to the hook. They would not touch it, and having learnt their lesson not to ignore the old tales, departed and never returned. The priest, not wanting the handle to fall into innocent hands, decided to keep it as a reminder to those that evil lurks in the shadows. And it's still there, attached to the front door, and would be easy to miss, thinking it's just an ornate knocker and not the handle to a devil's law. Knowing this, would you be brave enough to knock?